Welcome to our third of our summer 2021 alumni webinar series. For the panelists who don't know me well, my name is Kendall Gray. I'm the Changemaker Collaborative Program Assistant at the UNH Sustainability Institute. I support our student-facing programming, including but not limited to the Sustainability Fellowship, of which this webinar series is a part of. Additionally, I'm an alumna of the 2019 Sustainability Fellowship cohort and graduate of UNH's class of 2020. 2 weeks ago, we were joined by our moderator, Michelle VC, and panelists Austin, Jill, and Rachel for a discussion on sustainable business. And today, we are joined by another group of panelists who are all fellows for what used to be the Clean Air, Cool Planets Fellowship Program prior to its merge with the UNH Sustainability Institute. We are excited for you to hear their journey in working to improve the world. And now I'm going to allow my colleague Jennifer Andrews to introduce herself and today's moderator.
Thanks, Kendall. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you. As most of you know, I'm Jen. I'm a project director at the Sustainability Institute, and also, as Kendall just alluded to, the founder of what was originally a climate fellowship program created at the nonprofit Clean Air, Cool Planet now more than a decade ago. Before we brought it here to the UNH Sustainability Institute, broadened it to be the Sustainability Fellowship, and joined forces with the Social Innovation Internship Program. So that history means that I had the distinct pleasure of working directly with each of today's panelists when they did their fellowships, and I'm so thrilled to see you guys. I am looking forward to hearing more about what you're all up to these days, and I'm really grateful to you for making the time to talk with us. I'm also so grateful and honored to introduce to you all our moderator for today's session, Kat's mentor, and an expert in the field, Jeffrey Cohn. Jeff is a supervisory team lead for the EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics. In this role, he leads a team that's focused on ensuring that the office not only follows through, but exceeds its statutory obligation to inform stakeholders about regulatory and sustainability program developments. So beyond this work, Jeff's taken on many different and interesting roles at the EPA, seen lots of ins and outs. He worked with its pollution prevention program on strategic planning and implementation initiatives, ran an innovation program designed to provide seed funding for radically new policy approaches, and served as its metal casting liaison in the sector strategies program. And in addition to his work with the EPA, Jeff's an adjunct professor for American University, where he teaches a class on sustainable purchasing. And he's a wildcat. He earned a BA in economics from the University of New Hampshire, as well as a master's of business administration with a concentration in environmental management and policy from George Washington University. And with that, Jeff, thank you again. Over to you.
Okay, excellent. When the slides disappeared, I lost track of my mute button. So there it is. Well, welcome everybody. And we have a really interesting panel. I was reading up on them. I think the first step is to just have the panel introduce themselves, talk about your background a little bit and how you got into the field, and then we'll take it from there. Now let's see, we have, I want to make sure name sitting in front of me. So we have Timothy Ryder. You go by Tim or Timothy? Is he on the call?
He's here, but it looks like maybe he got pulled away for a second.
Okay.
So
No
maybe
problem.
Yeah, I go by Tim. Thanks.
Tim. Okay, great. And then you're legislative aide with U.S. Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer. Sounds exciting. And then we'll just go through the names and positions really quick. So we have Kelly Flick. Is that how you pronounce your name? The P is silent.
Kelly Flicka, thank you. Very close. Very good.
Okay, good. And you're a community planner from FEMA. I'm so facile with federal government acronyms. I don't even bother to spell them out. Federal Emergency Management Agency, and we have Rebecca Owens, Associate Planner of City of Lebanon, New Hampshire. You're on the line too, correct? Rebecca.
You're muted.
I know, I had to find the mute button. Thank you.
So Rebecca, now that your mute is off, why don't you start us off and talk to us about your position and how you got there, please.
Sure. Well, my current position as associate planner is within a larger department of planners for the small city of Lebanon. We have about almost 14,000 people in our population, but it's almost a it's a much larger regional area. So we have a lot of housing and jobs in Lebanon and serve over 36,000 people in the Lebanon daily operations. So I also work with senior planners and the director of planning and building inspectors. And I've been there for going on 4 years this coming September. And my role there is primarily master plan implementation. We refer to the master plan in Lebanon pretty closely for informing our capital improvement projects and policy and similar efforts and how we prioritize what we do in the city. So as part of that, I end up doing a lot of project management and some grant management and applications for those grants to fund the projects, whether it's related to pedestrian and bicyclist matters or heritage issues. Those are my primary focus areas. And also engagement. So I just mentioned two focus areas. So I'm the city staff liaison to our Ped Bike Advisory Committee and our Heritage Commission, which is regulatory and oversees a historic district. And then I would say the fourth tier to all that is policy development. So as part of the master plan implementation, we're always striving to integrate more, I guess I'll call it modern strategies into our zoning and site plan regulations, and then the policies that complement those, such as our complete streets policy and climate policy.
Excellent.
So that's my current position.
Great. And just quickly, what is your academic background?
I studied environmental policy, graduated in 2003 from Wellesley College in the Boston area. And then about 10 years later, graduated from Antioch University, New England, with an MBA in organizational management for sustainability.
Great, great, thank you. Kelly, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So Kelly Flicka, I serve as a community planner with Fema, and I started with Fema in Region 2, which covers New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. But in March of this year, transitioned to headquarters to support the hazard mitigation planning program. And we are situated, there are many different divisions, as you can imagine, within a large agency, but we are housed under Resilience and the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration and the Risk Management Directorate. So activities like flood mapping, the funding of mitigation grants all fall within FEMA. But my specific program that I work to support is focused on hazard mitigation planning. So we provide and develop the policies associated with the development of those plans, what are going to meet the minimum standards, and which help communities plan for their risk and take action to reduce risk, and also serve as an eligibility criteria for pre-disaster mitigation grants at FEMA. And my role on the team is to support strategic partnerships and communications to advance the program So thinking about where we can partner with other federal agencies on plan alignment, for example, and other areas to partner, whether it's through trainings and capacity building, and just how to advance our program delivery to states, locals, tribes, and territories.
Sounds very interesting. So can you give us your academic background, please?
Sure. So for an undergrad, I studied geography and went back to school to get a master's in city and regional planning, and graduated in 2014. And between my first and second years at grad school, completed the fellowship with Clean Air Coal Planet.
And I have a question coming on that later on, so we'll hear more about that. And Tim, if you could get on the line and talk about your current job and your academic background.
Most definitely. Hey, everybody. Let's see. My current job, as you mentioned earlier, I'm a legislative aide for Senator Schumer. In non-Washington speak, that means I work with him on advising him on policy issues. I'm his lead policy person on Fema, and I'm a part of our kind of climate and energy and environment team. So as you can imagine, this is a very busy time as we work to finalize the infrastructure package. But I'm excited to get to join you and chat as I'm actually riding my way up to New York right now. So let's see. Before this job, I worked for former Vice President Gore, where if you've ever seen It Could Be a Truth, I helped work on his slideshow. So I was the science nerd behind those slides. Happy to talk more about all the fun things we do in the Senate and the mysterious black box it can seem from the outside. And oh yes, and my academic background, I went to Stetson University, a small university you've probably never heard of down in Central Florida. Did one semester at American University with their Washington semester program, and was able to do the Clean Air Cool Planet Fellowship. I think it was between my sophomore and junior years. I'm excited to be with you all today.
Great. So the second question is, how does your work fit under the broad banner of public policy? I feel like we're all working in the federal context, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about what you do for public policy. Rebecca, you want to go first again?
Sure. So I think I mentioned that.
Sorry.
Okay. I think I mentioned that in Lebanon, we use the master plan as a guiding document a lot, but the master plan is not a policy itself. It's a vision document. It's something that takes extensive public engagement to develop, and it identifies the priorities of the community. If in New Hampshire, at least according to our state law, a community decides to have a master plan, you have to have certain chapters in it, like land use is one of them. And that, so then there are other more optional chapters, whether it's energy related or historic resources related, so on. So this vision document then informs public policy. So the public policies that stem from the master plan, well, actually, I should say they're regulations and policies that come from it. So the regulations are enforceable, policies not necessarily. You often need to have regulations developed that help to implement policy and in turn implement a vision document like the master plan. So in Lebanon right now, for example, just to show how the vision turned to on the ground policy implementation, and going back to the complete streets example, a complete street is a street for everyone, basically. So all modes of mobility, transportation, so bikes, pedestrians, cars are usually the main ones, in transit. And we adopted a complete streets policy in 2017, and it refers back to federal standards for how to design for complete streets. But usually you need local policy that's context-based to really make that happen. So the policy then trickled down into over a year now of work with our ped bike committee, our planning board. Those are the two primary boards to draft updated site plan and subdivision regulations that require more provisions for dedicated facilities like pedestrian aisles and parking lots, and safe crossings at roadways, and bike racks and showers in buildings, and things that just make it a bit easier to be someone who's not moving around by an automobile, and safer primarily. So that evolved over many, many meetings. You'd be surprised how nuanced this type of process can get, and finally adopted some amendments to our regulations last week. But hopefully what I'm illustrating is that it's usually not just one document and one commitment that creates policy or implements it. It often involves a variety of tools and engagement approaches.
Great. Kelly, you want to go next?
Sure. So maybe building off of some of Rebecca's comments at the local level around planning. So I think it's been really interesting for me to see the different opportunities to engage in policy where, whether it be at the regional level when I was working with Region 2 or now at headquarters, there's just a different scope and scale to the work, it seems. So when I was with Region 2, we were really working with our, what we call SLTTs, states, locals, tribes, territories, to partner with them, provide technical assistance, guidance as requested, and was really providing feedback and working in partnership with, for instance, our states that might be developing policies for municipalities or guidance as it relates to resilience planning, for example. Where at headquarters, my work has been more so focused on contributing to policy development around our policies for state and local plans, hazard mitigation plans. So what Rebecca mentioned about sort of, you have regulations, we have regulations that require this planning and sort of outline the roles of different, the federal government, of states and locals in this process, and then policy helps to interpret that regulation and provide detail and additional guidance on how you meet those requirements. And so it's been neat to have an opportunity to engage in those conversations when thinking about sort of the delivery of the program at a national level. So no longer thinking solely about just one region, but having to think about sort of the different needs across the country, the different affinity for planning or lack of affinity for planning, different, yeah, it's been interesting. And then I guess tying into Tim's work, and maybe he can expand further, but just getting some insights into how the agency engages with or is asked to engage with congressional staff in conversations as they look to develop legislation, and we provide feedback on how that might impact the agency or the delivery of our programs.
Great. And Tim.
Yeah, so I mean, I think as Kelly said, I bother Fema all the time for technical assistance on things, like on a regular basis. But my job is to write the legislation, write the laws, to work with a broad group of stakeholders to ensure that it represents, what our constituents need, but also in the unique position in the leader's office to make sure it represents the entire caucus. Writing that, it's a pretty astounding thing and a little terrifying, honestly, the first time, you're working on something that actually is meant to go in a bill that then passes and becomes law. it's a bit of an awesome responsibility. And, I studied environmental science. I didn't come into this as a poli-sci person who's, been studying legislation. And it really just speaks to the incredible resources that are around you when you're in these positions. The opportunity to approach the individuals at Fema to ask them for technical assistance, the expertise of the Senate Legislative Council and, of the other coworkers. But, I remember back to the first time I wrote a law that actually was enacted. And it is a pretty awesome responsibility and exciting to see how that can then impact so many people. I think one of the greatest things I'll probably ever do in my entire life was to work on the FEMA funeral assistance program, to negotiate that in the end of year 2020 package that we had. That program, for those of you who don't know, provides money up to $9,000 to cover the cost of funeral and cemetery expenses for, if you lost a loved one to COVID. And to work on putting that together, passing that into law, and then now spending the last, 6 months working with FEMA to actually roll that out, and to see the program now help, provide, we're getting close to $300 million to, Americans across the country. It's a pretty astounding feeling to realize that your hard work and perseverance and effort and like the knowledge and expertise of you and all the people around you, distilled down into that piece of legislation can actually really have a meaningful impact on people's lives.
That is impressive. And, I just want to reiterate some things that the three of you have said. One is that it's always great to have a vision before you're developing your policy and your approaches. Having strategic vision is always helpful, but also having a policy vision. I've noticed that my local government does a really good job with creating passing various visionary documents before they go forward with the regulations. I think that's always really smart. But the other thing I want to reinforce is that public policy is really identifying public problems and identifying public solutions to those problems. And that can range from a whole bunch. It could be legislation, it could be regulations, it could just be a voluntary program. I worked for a program called the Pollution Prevention Program that gave money to universities and to states to help businesses identify pollution prevention opportunities in their businesses. And that doesn't involve a regulation. It doesn't involve necessarily a policy or anything else. It's just encouraging people to do the right thing, especially businesses that are developing the pollution. So, when you're thinking about public policy, I would think that there's all sorts of things you can do. I also work with environmental purchasing, which is really about green labels. And there's nothing about regulation that involves green labeling, but that is a public policy that is moving our country forward into sustainability. So let's see, let's get on to the next question. And that's here. Why do you do what you do? What gets you excited to get out of bed every day? Besides your cat like jumping on you and telling you it needs to be fed. Kelly.
Wow, so many things. I do think that climate change is the preeminent challenge, of our time. And I think the field of planning and policy, have huge roles in that. And I just see there is, a vast amount of opportunity to engage on these issues and incorporate them into our programs. And so there's not a lack of activity or work. And so I guess I'm just inspired by the opportunity to, make a difference. And I haven't had one of those moments that Tim has had in terms of like seeing big legislation or contributing and seeing that text, but I can imagine that was an amazing feeling. But on a smaller scale, I have seen, projects that I've contributed to from a concept stage then come, to life. And it's just, I don't know, I leave with a feeling that, even if every day isn't moving the needle, in a huge way, I know that like what I'm contributing to is worth my time and it's worth the effort. So.
Tim, can you go and take this one?
Sure. I often think back when I was 11, I went to Hawaii. My cousin was marrying a native Hawaiian man. He worked at the National Botanical Gardens out there. And we go out and we're getting a tour a couple of days before the wedding. And his boss is this rock star biologist and tells us the story about how he's rappelling down these cliffs, comes across these plants he's never seen before. And he's the head biologist, right? He should see every plant. Takes a picture of it, puts it up on the old school version of the internet. A paleobiologist reaches out, tells him that this is a plant that essentially should have been extinct for like 100 million years. So him and his team go out, they observe it, find out, these little white flowers bloom. It kind of looks like a baseball bat with a cabbage on top. These white flowers bloom, they die, no seeds are produced. Find out that the pollinator that used to pollinate this plant just doesn't exist anymore. It's a giant moth that had gone extinct. So they go out there and they hand pollinate these flowers with Q-tips. They're able to go and get the seeds. And if you actually come here to Washington, D.C. and go to the National Botanical Gardens, you can see this plant on display along with the whole story. It's absolutely incredible. And so there I am, like an 11-year-old, my jaw is on the floor, like for the first time realizing that I love plants, I love the environment, but if there's more opportunities to work in that space than to just be a farmer. And so I went on to study conservation biology. And that was my goal. And I was going to go protect mountain ecosystems like that one. But, took one of my first classes in college was all about issues in environmental science. And we learned about climate change was the first one. And I realized I could spend my entire life working to protect that one mountain ecosystem I love so much. And not only would none of my work matter, but none of the work of any of my colleagues would matter if climate change was left unchecked. So I switched my focus and have been working on climate ever since. And my joke is that when I solve climate change, I'll go back to fighting for my little mountain ecosystem that I love so much. But it's that wakes me up every day, that pushes me to keep going, that this is an existential threat that's facing our society that's just too great. And if I can expend any amount of energy to try to do something good about that, that is worth it, like 10 times over.
Excellent. And Rebecca.
That was a great story.
Yeah, that was good.
So, like many of us, you have dreams when you're younger, based on what you're exposed to. And I read a lot of National Geographic. I always thought maybe I'd write or do photography for them. That I never really pursued that. But I think as I got older and realized that the concrete jungle is another type of habitat that you can work on to help ensure that those other areas that you love, maybe not as exciting, not like going to Africa or elsewhere, but there's a lot to be done to help protect those resources by encouraging density, for example, and making the communities where we are already more livable for as many people as possible while protecting these other areas. So I think day to day and across jobs, what's gotten me out of bed is knowing that wherever I go, there's a chance to help with resource management in one way or another, even if I'm not directly in the field, taking samples or things like that. And the other thing that really helps me, although it's also daunting in many ways, is no day is the same. Planning is, or public policy, I should say, is a really diverse field. You tend to wear a lot of different hats unless you're an extreme technical specialist in one area like GIS, and even that tends to be very diverse. So I get to learn constantly. And sometimes it's stuff that no one's really worked on much before. You're at the vanguard, and even in a small city, you can be at the vanguard because maybe in a state like mine or a city like mine, there aren't a lot of examples to follow. And no matter what's being done for, the smart grid or climate resilience in a big city, your audience is so different. You end up having to be really creative, and there's no template to follow. So I think that the challenge of that diversity and how dynamic all these issues are is really stimulating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that everything you said resonated with me, all three of you. One thing I think I want to say about public policy, and maybe it's a little bit better at the legislative with Tim, where he's getting some more immediate feedback, and Rebecca, where you're at the local level, you might be getting some things through a little faster. But the federal level, it's very incremental. A rule takes 2 years to complete. That's minimum. We don't get rules through very fast, but if a rule goes through, it's permanent. That policy is then permanent. So a lot of what I'm doing right now is doing outreach engagement on rules that we're working on for the Toxic Substances Control Act. So I'm trying to organize a meeting right now with states. It's called a federalism consultation on these chemicals, trichloroethylene, tetrachloroethylene, and implementing it. And those rules won't pass for years. So day to day, getting out of bed, you're just thinking, let's get that next step done. And you have to feel satisfied with this idea that you are passing some really good policy. And I think this, happens at different gauges. Like some things take a year to pass, some things take a few years to pass. But you really have to think through that you're just getting that next step done, and that there's some satisfaction with working with the people that are working on that, and thinking about it, and interfacing with the right people to make that happen. Okay. So let's hear about the fellowships. What fellowships did you take on, and how did that apply to your jobs as moving forward? Tim, do you want to start first this time?
Sure. Let's see. So I was working with a tool called Chefs. Chefs was a calculator that was supposed to help us ascertain what the emissions profile for your school was in a more complete way, because it was looking at your cafeteria, right? And food issues at the time were a really hot button topic. So I worked on a lot of life cycle analysis and kind of data standardization. Which was a really interesting start to my career, because it forced me to really engage with spreadsheets in a practical way, right? A lot of the kind of use of spreadsheets I'd had in school was, never really kind of rose to this level of applicability. And in my next job, one of the things that I would do for Gore is help keep track of all of the policies and different topics that we were keeping an eye on around the world and in the US. And that kind of ability to create pivot tables and do kind of more advanced spreadsheet work kind of translated there, and is still something I use on a regular basis as I track bills and stakeholder engagement and everything else. Cannot highly recommend enough learning as much as you can about Excel while you have this chance in this kind of educational environment. I was also able to help out with a climate adaptation project that they were working on at the time, working with a small town, essentially helping them develop a climate adaptation plan. Since I was going to school down in Florida, adaptation was such a huge topic down there. Nobody particularly wanted to talk about mitigation, or at least reducing your greenhouse gases, but folks were very open to acknowledging that the sunny day flooding in Miami was a problem, and that the coastal resiliency was something that really mattered. So finding ways to kind of weave that in, became a really enjoyable part of that summer's project. And still to this day, those giant reports that I read, there in my time with Clean Air, Cool Planet are things that I still reference back to. So, it's impossible in the moment to realize how some of these skills that you're learning right now and some of these knowledge sources, how incredibly useful they'll be. But really encourage everyone to go and read the, for us, it's the AR5, the big IPCC climate report, and these other documents that at no other point in your life are you going to have time to read. My God, I have like a giant multi-gigabyte folder of reports that someday I'm going to get around to reading, but I just don't have time to anymore. So really do that as much as you can now.
Hey, Rebecca, next, please.
So my fellowship was to aggregate the campus carbon calculator data from Second Nature, which is, or it was, or is a partner of Clean Air, Cool Planet, as it was called back in 2013. And with that aggregated data to assess the both individual campus performance toward greenhouse gas reduction goals, but moreover to identify common metrics and strategies that were between those campuses and which ones could be identified as useful for benchmarking between campuses, because not every institution of higher education tackles greenhouse gas mitigation in the same way, whether some are still focusing on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, or getting more into scope 3, and very few at the time were getting into environmentally preferable purchasing, for example, and embedded carbon. I'm sure that's changed by now, but to identify those metrics and share the results, including pivot tables. Can't say I can do one now, but it was a great experience to learn how to do them then. And really, it was really fascinating to be exposed to the variety of strategies, because with the calculator, they're set formulas for how you can calculate the emissions for certain activities, but when it comes down to it, a lot of them have to be customized for certain fuel sources or really specific context at an institution. That while that made data harder to compare apples to apples in many cases, just the exposure even to, for example, how commuter surveys and who's included in those to calculate your commuter footprint, for example, was really instructive in future jobs that I had. And eventually I was able to co-present the results at the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. And so from a professional experience with presentation, that was also a good experience.
Excellent. And Kelly?
Yeah, I think following this theme of data analysis, I really think the fellowship was foundational to my sort of area of the field and my career. So my project was on behalf of, or in partnership with, at the time called the New Jersey Climate Adaptation Alliance, which has now shifted its name to New Jersey Climate Change Alliance. Small nuance there, but at the time, the state government was not out on front on climate change. So these university partners and others had formed an alliance to produce research and develop policy recommendations to the state to address climate change. And my fellowship project was to help the alliance conceptualize, understand both who and where were populations that were more vulnerable to climate change. So I had the opportunity to really dive into understanding just how we define vulnerability, what are the social characteristics of that, and then what is sort of the field of research in terms of how do you then operationalize that to identify where there might be sort of clusters of high-risk populations to climate change. And so after conducting research on those topics, identified a national index that has been used, and then worked with a faculty advisor to sort of customize that for the state of New Jersey, and then developed a white paper and associated mapping resources for the Alliance so that they could see where populations were located and sort of what the characteristics were that make folks more at risk to climate change, more vulnerable to climate change. So that work was really important to me. I mean, I was drawn to the field of planning and I guess larger public policy. Jeff, to get back to your point about how it's about solving, public problems and working in the public interest. And to me, it was a no-brainer to think about, if you're interested in climate change, those that are most impacted by it, and trying to reduce risk to those populations. So after completing my fellowship and completing my graduate degree, my first full-time paid position out of school, I think my fellowship really contributed to me getting that job. I sent my white paper to the hiring manager, and it was an area of work that they wanted to start to include in their hazard mitigation plans. It was for an engineering and planning firm, a consulting firm, and it's just so. It feels a very 360 moment in my career to now be, working at headquarters on the program where I really got my feet wet and actually developing the plans for which headquarters sort of sets the policies and guidance around what those should look like. And then I think just following the social vulnerability and at-risk populations thread throughout my career, I was able, because through the fellowship, you're able to spend time reading those reports and building an area of expertise, advocate through other positions, public positions, to start to incorporate and consider these populations in our planning frameworks, in our policies, where folks maybe didn't know how, or it wasn't a priority. And so, yeah, I think this fellowship experience was amazing, and I think a lot of folks that are on the line now, will be able to tell a similar story in a few years as well.
Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm looking through. I see some comments in the Q&A, but if you just want to speak up and ask a question of the group, I think that's okay, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Anybody have any questions? You can type it into the Q&A, or you can, I did see one from Kat about the, I think it was in reference to what Tim was saying about his law for paying for funeral expenses, and whether that extended beyond COVID to other natural disasters. So Tim, what was the extent of that law?
Yeah, so it's a form of FEMA assistance. It's called individual assistance, so it's assistance for people, not for like entities. And it's kind of nested way far down. It's only been used at a handful of times. It's really reserved for the worst of the worst disasters. They used it after Hurricane Sandy on a very limited basis. They used it after Hurricane Katrina. Actually was the biggest utilization of the program. It was used for about 2,500 or 3,000, somewhere in that range, individuals. So it's a form of assistance that the state that was hit by the disaster would request from FEMA. FEMA would then provide a recommendation to the president. The president would then make a decision as to whether or not to grant that assistance. In this case, we had been working to pressure President Trump to activate this assistance for about a year. he had refused to engage with us on it. And so we took a pretty bold step of actually just passing it into law to actually activate the assistance ourselves. And so, other disasters in the future can use it, but, for now, this is the largest utilization of the program, by almost 100-fold.
Okay, interesting.
I had a question, and Jeff, this is kind of more directed at you. So something that you were saying was that like, it's really cool when you write a policy, even though it takes 2 years, it becomes like a rule. And I was just wondering what it's like when you maybe I guess through the perspective of the EPA, when you write a rule that can help prevent, I don't know, environmental hazards to human health. And what happens when those rules like get repealed, because sometimes new administrations puts new things in place. So can you kind of talk about that experience and maybe a little bit about kind of your perspective when you think things are really important, and then when they go away, how do you feel, and how does that impact your job?
Oh man. Yeah, I mean, we worried about, about the regulations being, some of the regulations we were working on in the toxics. So I'm in the toxics office. There's a water office, there's an air office, there's a land office. I'm in the toxics office where we do reviews of toxics. And they were less inclined, the previous administration was less inclined to just outright throw out rules before, but they did take some shortcuts and maybe didn't follow public health recommendations the way they should have. So when the new administration came in, they did do a broad review of the rules that we had been working on and slowed them down. They stopped them and said, we need to step back and think through the evaluations that we were already doing. And we were a little bummed about that because the evaluations already showed some pretty big hazards that we could work on, but they said, no, we want to take a step back and really make sure these hazards are done properly. Now, the big question in my mind that I never encountered was, what if I was in the air office and I was working on a climate change rule and a new administration came in and said, Jeff, your job now is to back out that rule. Your job is to pass another law, another regulation that does not meet that standard. It's much lower than that standard. And I have to say, I would probably either go find another job or I would leave EPA. I was never put in that position, but when the Trump administration came in, boy, I'm being super political now, but when they came in, I did start thinking about what was my red line. What, if someone asked me to do something that I did not morally support, would I hang in there? Would I leave? And I made some decisions on my own. But yeah, that happens, administration to administration. Priorities change, and it may not be the stuff that you are working on. And the stuff you were working on that you thought was a high priority is no longer a high priority. And that can happen whether it's a Democratic administration or Republican administration. And sometimes you just have to, as a public policy person, you just have to kind of go with the flow and hope that your issue comes around again. So hope that didn't take up too much time. Any other panelists want to weigh in on that issue?
I'll just say that I think to your point that like regulations, there is a public process to them. And I mean, to hear you say 2 years, that's pretty quick. I was thinking more like 3 to 5 to 6.
Bare minimum, yeah.
Potentially longer. So I think that's the idea, is that those things are slower to change and will, may extend past any current administration. So yeah, versus like an EO or sort of a direction or priorities of a specific administration, those might be able to shift priorities more quickly. It's those regulations that will be harder to change.
What I would say about it is that it's not necessarily about things going backwards at the local level, but being watered down. And I think this is probably applicable to everyone here from what you originally were aiming for once they finally get adopted. So that goes to the incremental change and being okay with that, versus trying to get policy perfect up front. You just aim high, and let people chip away at it. It's going to happen, but aim high to start with.
Okay, let's move on to a next question. Hannah had one for Rebecca.
I'm not sure I see it.
I think she Kendall, did you say Hannah had one that she wanted to speak out loud to?
Yeah,
Oh,
Hannah,
now
do
I
you
do.
wanna, says, how has working for a municipality differed from working at a state or federal level? Do you find it easier / faster to facilitate change, or do you find that there are still roadblocks to rapid sustainability improvements?
Well, Hannah, if I can slightly shift the question, because I haven't worked at the state or federal level, but I have worked for private companies, both consulting for clients and then as a company itself. When you are implementing policy and you answer to more stakeholders, like at the federal level, you're going to have to make things more generalized so that any policy you put in place can apply to as many of the beneficiaries as possible. At local level, you tend to know your stakeholders a bit better, but it still can be very diverse. And so I wouldn't say they're more roadblocks or less at the local versus federal level. But to go back to what I was saying, between the corporate versus or company level versus municipal and state and federal, private entities have a lot more unilateral power to institute policy. But there's so many right to know laws and crossover laws when you work at the local, state, and federal level that compliance becomes one of the biggest challenges, the biggest roadblocks, because there's something called preemption, for example. At the local level where I am, for example, we can't just say we want to adopt a new energy code, because the state might already have an energy code that it's adopted, and in turn that might be a national code. So we have to find what the, for lack of other words, loopholes are for things we can do to have a more progressive energy standard in our municipality. So I think just that interconnectedness of everything, especially when you work in government, can be a huge challenge to rapid sustainability improvements.
Well said. And I think that's, unfortunately, I wish this was more like an hour and a half long, but because I'm really enjoying hearing from the other panelists. But that's really well said, that the interconnectedness and the importance of each level of government. You know, there's a need and a role for federal, state, and local, and they all are critical. So I want to thank the panelists. We have a bunch of questions here. Kendall offered to put them together in an email, and maybe we could try to answer them. The panelists can try to answer them, you know, via email. But unfortunately, we need to wrap up. So I want to thank the panelists. It was a really exciting conversation. I was so impressed with Tim, able to manage this in the passenger, hopefully the passenger seat. I think that was a passenger seat of a car. And I want to thank the students for your engagement and interest in this panel. We had a great time. So I'm going to hand it over to Jen to sign us out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff, for moderating this conversation. And Kelly and Tim and Rebecca, thank you again for for all of the great work you've been doing and for sharing that work and your perspectives with us. I've just been reflecting as I've been listening to this about how Cleaner Co-Planet, which is again where that fellowships program kind of first started and where I started my own career in sustainability in 2000, was founded in a large part as a reaction to the advent of the second Bush administration, which at that time was quite adverse to sustainability and climate and other environmental policy. And so the kind of idea behind CACP when it was founded was to go around the roadblocks that were being put up by the feds and instead leverage what we talked about as grass tops leadership by focusing on campuses and local governments and businesses who weren't waiting for regulation. If we in a policy in a very literal sense, regulation, but they were demonstrating climate leadership and innovation of the type that Jeff talked about in the absence of kind of federal law, legislation or regulation. And so in many ways that I'm thinking about how that has proved a sound approach, and that how the stories you heard about in the fellowships and in the work since figuring out, working with spreadsheets and digging through dense reports and experimenting and collaborating, figuring out what works and what doesn't at the level of individual programs and individual organizations and communities, such an important part of the journeys that you heard about today. And so having that on the ground perspective that you are all getting and being part of this summer has informed the work of our panelists and is enabling them to be really fantastic policymakers and implementers. So, it's like personally gratifying to me to see that Cleaner Cool Planet approach has merit and that there's value in the work at all of the levels, and it's helped bring us all here. And of course, I'm thinking about how now this is a moment where we know we have to scale it up. And that all that individual leadership has to be, has to add up to transformation, and that is the role of policy at all of those levels that you all talked about. So please know that whether you see yourself as being part of like making policy or not, that it needs to be informed by your perspectives as practitioners. We need all of our voices and stories to be heard to continue to build momentum for these challenges. And I just want to say again, at a personal level, that I'm thinking about the last 20 years of doing the work and seeing how favorable policy environments they come, and maybe we take great advantage of them, and maybe we have some misses, and then they go. But my hope is that we're at a moment where we can make the huge strides we need to at the federal level, and that even when the political conditions aren't favorable, there's always progress to be made if we are as brave and persistent and patient and collaborative and dedicated as our panelists and moderators. So you all inspire me. I just want to say thank you.